Good morning. And as promised, we're going to be talking about right now two things that are due in the next couple of weeks. The first one is the final project proposal, which is due September the 9th. But before you can do that, you need to understand what the final project is. So I'm going to start with that. Then we're going to talk about the proposal, which is, as I said, due on the 9th. And then we're going to talk about the critical thinking exercise that is due this coming Saturday. So let's start with the final project. I mentioned in the syllabus and in the syllabus video that you need to have a current news feed, preferably, not even preferably, something that is in print, not video. The whole idea behind it is for you to be able to understand perspective and persuasion and to consider what is an actual fact versus someone's interpretation of that fact. So with that in mind, hopefully you've been keeping up with the current news feed, because what I need for you to do starting now, definitely, if not before, is to consider what the major problems in the world are today. This is a contemporary history course. We come all the way up to the present. And as the generation that stands next to take control of the world, it's up to you guys to figure out what you consider to be important and what really needs to be addressed. In order to understand that, though, you have to understand the history behind things. Um, so, where we're starting with this is that you need to consider what you think to be the biggest issue facing the world today so that you can trace its history through the course and then discuss what, if anything, can be done about it, and if so, what you propose to do. So, with that in mind, the final project proposal, which you will submit to me on September the 9th, is your suggestion for what this is. And I have an actual final project proposal guideline that I'll show you in a minute. There are 4 sections of questions you need to answer when you submit this. But among the things that you can do, you can either do it as a paper, you can do it as a video, live action or animated, or you can submit to me some other potential creative project that you want to do. You may do it alone, or you may do it as a group, but the group can have no more than 3 people. And for every person who is in the group, the minimal amount extends. So I'll talk about that in just a minute as well. You cannot do a video of you reading the paper. I'd rather just see the paper. You cannot do a podcast of you reading the paper. I'd rather see the paper. But if you want to do something else, you can suggest to me what that might be in your proposal, and I will consider it, and we'll talk about it. You also cannot do a PowerPoint. This is something where you have to actually give me real hard fact data research, not skim points. So, all right. So that proposal, and again, I'll go over it with the specifics in just a minute, will be due September the 9th. In week 7, you need to give me a list of your preliminary sources. And in this case, it is basically to make sure you're tracking and keeping up with doing the work on the paper. You'll need a minimum of 6 secondary sources, not counting the books we're using in the course. You may use them in the course of doing the paper. In fact, I think you kind of have to use the textbook, but you may not use them as one of your mandatory 9 other sources. You need a minimum of 6 secondary sources, not counting anything we're using in the course, and a minimum of 3 primary sources, at least 2 of which are from 2 different centuries prior to the year 2001. You can obviously use a primary source from the present, but you need 2 primary sources from previous centuries. If you're writing a paper, the minimum page count of text, which does not include your works cited or your title page, is 10 pages. If you're working in a group, then it's 10 pages per person. So if there are 2 of you working together, it's 20 pages. If there are 3 of you working together, it's 30 pages. If you are doing a video and you're doing it by yourself, the minimum length is 5 minutes. If you're doing it with another person, it's 10 minutes. If you're doing it with a third person as well, it's 15. Now, because this is an asynchronous class, if you're going to work as a group, first you need to figure out what you think the biggest problem is, and then you need to send out a message to the class as a whole, um, in which you look for people who have also figured out or decided that that's an important, if not the most important issue facing us. So, because you have to justify that, and that means all of you need to be on point or in agreement about that issue and how you're going to approach it. All right, so the preliminary list of sources is due in week 7. In week 10, you have an annotated bibliography, and I will have specific instructions on how you're doing that as well. The reason for the difference between the two is because as you get into doing the annotated bibliography, you may discover that some of your preliminary sources don't actually work as well as you thought they would. The annotated bibliography is exactly that. You're going to take each of your sources, you're going to analyze them. For secondary sources, you're going to be looking at the methodology that the person who wrote it used to come up with their conclusions. You're going to be looking at what they set out to prove in the course of writing their source or creating their source. You're going to look at their perspective on this particular issue or whatever it is, and then you're going to demonstrate to me, or at least put into the annotation to me, how you're going to use this source in your paper. If it's a primary source, you're going to be looking at the bias of the person who wrote it. Give me a little bit of the historical framing around when they wrote it and what its significance is, and how, again, what it's going to be used for in your paper. Again, we'll go over that in more detail as we get closer. The annotated bibliography is worth 15% of your final grade, so you definitely want to be sure that you're on top of that one. And then the final project itself is due in week 14. Regardless of what form it takes, it must have internal citation and a works cited list. If you're doing a video, I've had successful videos in the past where, as someone was doing the video, when they edited it at the bottom of the screen where they were using information from a source, they would just insert a caption with the citation. And then, of course, in the end credits, they would list their works cited. So it is possible to do this without it being a big pain in the butt. It just does require editing. All right, and then some of the things you need to think about. It's going to trace the history of this particular issue from the 1400s to the present, which means that it's got to be something that you can do that with. If your concern is AI, then you're going to need to do like a long history of the evolution of technology, starting in the 1400s, going through every century, talking about technological advancement in every century, and how we get to AI. It should include accounts of the impact on previous society through quotes from the primary sources, as well as at least one account of how it impacts us today, which can be from a secondary source or a primary source. How previous generations viewed this problem. This would be part of what we refer to as the historiography. When did this issue become something known to the general public? Why has nothing been done about it in the past, or was something done about it but it wasn't enough, which means you need to consider whether previous societies also viewed this as an issue. Who historically has benefited from either the problem or the response to the problem, and why? How do we view the history of this problem issue today, and why? What can be done about it today? Are we doing something about it? If not, why not? And if so, how so? So that's the basic elements of your final project and what you need to consider when you're considering what issue you want to address. All right, so this has been posted. I'll show you where it's been posted in the content page. I'll show you in just a minute where it is, and they're the most important stuff file at the top. I'm also obviously sending it to you in the email that has the link to this video in it. Okay, so with that now, I'm going to go to the actual primary source proposal. And this is what is due on September the 9th. Having spent several weeks reading different sources about current world issues and events, consider the most serious issues in the world today. Then choose the one that you think is the most serious. But before you do that, consider how much research you can do on it backdating to the 1400s, because again, it does have to be something you can trace the history of in some capacity from the 1400s to the present. All right, so the first part's probably the part that's going to take the longest. Identify the issue and cite 2 sources that you have read about it. And what that means is 2 sources from your text news feeds, newspapers, news articles, something that is actually text, where it's having to present the issue to you with a lot more information than you're going to find in a video feed. I don't want anything from Fox or CNN or anything like that, where the perspective of the media is obviously biased from the start. I want something like a newspaper or AP or Reuters or somewhere where people are trying to give you factual information from the get-go. I'm not saying they don't have bias, because they do, but it needs to be something where obviously the facts are more significant than the interpretation of them. Why do you think this is the most serious? Are there others that are equally concerning? Why is this the one you chose? This is the first part of your proposal. The second part is, what sort of project do you want to do? And this will be shorter. This is, you can either tell me you want to do a paper or multimedia, or this is where you can propose something else if there's something else you want to do. Why do you want to do this, and why should I let you? As in, consider whether this is actually something you're doing a real research on. If you're trying to do something where you're going to shortcut the amount of work, I'm going to tell you no. So bear that in mind. Part 3, will it be your work alone, or will you be working in a group? And if so, list all the members. Again, no more than 3 people. And again, for each person added, there's a multiplier. As I said, if you decide that you're going to do a paper and it's going to be 2 of you, the minimum text amount is 20 pages. If you decide that you're going to do a multimedia or a video of some sort, it's 5 minutes per person in the group, which means up to 15 minutes. If you're doing it as a group, you can submit one project proposal for all 3 of you. Just be sure you all submit the same one, right? What do you hope to achieve or learn or prove with this project and this topic? That is part 4, and that is kind of giving you the opportunity to place it into context to the world you're inheriting. This again kind of feeds back to that whole idea of, why do you think this is the most important, and what do you hope to achieve through this? All right, so that is what is due to me on September the 9th. I already have a Dropbox set up for it, and in fact right now I will go to our page and show you where these things are. All right, this is our home page, Survey of Western Civ 2, Section 3. If you go to, well, first of all, if you go to Content, and if it gives me content, most important stuff, I have now added the final project and the final project proposal immediately below the syllabus, so you have access to those through the website. As we go along, for your preliminary sources list and for the annotated bibliography, I will be adding those there as well. And then where you will submit them, you're going to go to Activities and Assignments, and I have already created down here at the bottom the final project proposal box. Again, due to me September the 9th, as a Word file. It has to be something that Turnitin will accept. All right. Now, as you can see above, I have also established the critical thinking exercise place. So now let's go and look at what is due to me on Saturday. All right, for your critical thinking exercise, you're going to be doing this thing called the requirement. Now, at this point in time, after being here for 2 weeks, you should all be reasonably familiar with what happens when the Spanish arrive in the Western Hemisphere. As a little introduction, I'm not going to give you a huge one because most of you should have read this in the textbooks that you have and in Harari. The Spanish arrive first because Columbus declares the Western Hemisphere for Spain, starting literally in the late 1490s, early 1500s. The Spanish began the process of trying to convert the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is before the Protestant Reformation. We tend to date the start of the Protestant Reformation as 1517. That's when Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. Spain is exceptional in this period prior to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation because Spain itself has only very recently unified. It was, as in the discussion of empires, Spain was actually a collection of different kingdoms. And the southern part of what we recognize today as Spain was actually controlled by Muslims. Um, when the first big Islamic caliphate broke up in the 800s, there was a section of it in the lower part of what we recognize today as Spain that was an independent Islamic caliphate. And the very large, well, the largest kingdoms in northern Spain, Castile and Aragon, were Christian and were passionately Christian. And they, starting at about the mid 1400s, um, after competing with each other for a while for control, decided that they would be better served to unite and reclaim all of Spanish territory for a united Spain and Christendom. So Castile and Aragon, the kings thereof, united. Later, they would marry their children to become the first actual rulers of a united Spain. This would be Ferdinand and Isabella. And it would be Ferdinand and Isabella who would finance Columbus, because after these wars to drive the Muslims out of Spain and then to drive the Jewish people out of Spain, they needed a lot of money. They were basically destitute. So Isabella convinced Ferdinand to subsidize Columbus in hopes that this would be a mechanism by which they could start making more money back for the United Spain and for the papacy. The Spanish were militantly zealous about Catholicism, and not just any Catholicism, their interpretation of Catholicism. It helped that the Pope, for the most part, was related at this point in time to the Spanish monarchs. So they shared a view of Christianity, Catholic Christianity, as a mechanism for creating a united society. And the mechanism by which they would do this was by making sure that not only everybody in Spain was practicing Catholicism, but it would be that they were practicing their interpretation of Catholicism. This is part of where we get the ever popular Spanish Inquisition is out of this period. So they are zealously militant. um, the conquistadors themselves were basically soldiers in what they considered to be an army of God. And this document, the requirement, El Requerimiento, was written in 1513, again, before the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, as something that the conquistadors were ordered to read to the Native Americans in Spanish upon first contact. Now, bear in mind that at this point in time in the Western Hemisphere, there are only two big empires. There were the Aztecs and the Incas, one in Central America, one in South America. In North America, Cahokia was in decline, but it was the largest until that point in time North American society. Jared Diamond argues that the reason why there were not more large political structures in the Western Hemisphere prior to the 1400s was because there wasn't the availability of plants and animals to hybridize the way that there had been in Eurasia or the Eastern Hemisphere. And because of that, the population density in the Western Hemisphere didn't grow the way that it did in Eurasia, which is why you don't get large populations that eventually unite and create the big kingdoms and the big empires. This is from his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. Excellent book written in the 1990s and still one that is often taught. I actually use it in my Civ 1 class because Diamond's idea is that the lack of diversity of plants and animals in the Western Hemisphere versus the Eastern Hemisphere limited the availability of surplus foodstuffs, which limited population growth, which limited the growth of large political organizations. Thus, a number of the peoples that the conquistadors were meeting in the Western Hemisphere were people who were not part of large empires. Columbus met the Taino, who were not an organized group. what's his name? The guy who led the expedition looking for the Fountain of Youth throughout the southeast, well, modern day Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. He met a variety of different peoples in small village organizations, more so than in large organizations, um, and left records of that. But again, everywhere they went, they had to read this document to the indigenous peoples that they met. So the exercise for you then, getting to this, is that you will read the excerpts from this document. This is not the whole thing. You can tell by the dot, dot, dots. This is annotated and excerpted. You're going to read it, probably more than once, and then you're going to answer these questions. What's the purpose of the document? To justify making war on Native Americans? Why do you think that? Provide at least one piece of evidence from the document and explain. And you're allowed to go back and change your answer if you wish, and you may do that in that box. Now re-examine the document. Find two pieces of evidence from this document that contradict your reading above and explain how they do so. Based on your current understanding, how confident are you in your original reading of the document, and explain. Okay, so the purpose of this is literally purpose. Well, here, I want to take you to question 5 down here in this other page, because this will explain some of this. The exercise is intended to demonstrate the necessity of taking into account context and purpose when examining a primary source. Students often misunderstand historical documents by focusing too much on one piece of the document. And to be fair, students aren't alone in this. Historians do the same thing. We can fixate on one sentence, and different factions will develop in the historical profession arguing about the intent of that one sentence. But the thing is, you still have to take the document as a whole. You have to look at other things in it as well. This is the holistic approach, and it's designed to carefully consider the other available evidence, both in the document and outside of the document. And that's what we mean by context. Context is evidence outside the document. Read the whole document and ask yourself if your interpretation still makes sense. Who wrote this document, and why did they write this document? Often we forget that today, because we read and write, and we read and write great amounts, that prior to the 1800s, the vast majority of the population did not read and write. In the 1700s, and many of you brought up the printing press, yes, that will expand the reading population to approximately maybe 30 to 40% of the population as a whole, but there's still a huge chunk of the population that does not read and write. And even when people were reading and writing, the availability of paper or mediums upon which to write, the availability of ink and things with which to write were costly. It was not uncommon for documents to be written over 3 and 4 times because paper was expensive and ink was expensive. So people preserved what they wrote on as much as they could. So you're looking at people who have to consider specific reasons for what they're writing. Who wrote it? Why did they write it? Who was it addressed to? Who was the intended audience? In this case, who would be able to understand it? Does this piece of evidence match other evidence you have seen? And this is other evidence outside of the text itself. This would mean other things that you've read about the time period, about the Spanish themselves, about the indigenous people themselves. What other evidence have you seen outside of the source of document itself? If not, can you reconcile what you're reading to what you know outside of the source? All right, with all of that in mind, you might go about figuring out the most correct interpretation of the document, or how might you go about doing this? Can you think of 2 kinds of evidence outside of the document that you might seek out to help you better understand what was written? And then explain. All right, so this is what you're going to be doing. It is due to me by midnight Saturday night. Think about it seriously. I will point out that there is a discussion for week 3. You are not required to do the discussion. You are required to do this critical thinking exercise. You must do this. If you choose to do the discussion, which I actively encourage, because again, I'm going to be picking your top 6 discussion grades. So the more discussions you have, the more opportunities you have to have higher grades, and the discussions do get easier as you go along and begin to figure out more of what I actually want. I have now returned your first ones. I hope to get your second ones back to you in a timely manner, hopefully a more timely manner. Um, but the idea here is for you to analyze this primary source, particularly focusing on its purpose and its context, two of the big things that historians have to use to evaluate primary source material. You will need 3 primary sources for your final project, and you'll need to understand them in context and in purpose the same way that you're doing with this. So this is part of the, I think the vernacular now is scaffolding of getting you to being able to analyze your primary sources for your annotated bibliography and for the final paper or the final project. All right, if you have questions, email me. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your critical thinking responses to this primary source on Saturday.